Well, it's good to be back on the channel. I've had a long break, as many of you will know who've been following the channel. I just took some time off for the birth of my second son, and it's been about 4 months now since he was born. He's doing well. Thanks for a couple of people who left, well wishes in the comments and things like that. That's really appreciated. And I got to say, also, it's nice to see that the viewer count, in terms of subscribers, people who subscribed to the channel, that's pretty much doubled since I was last here. So yeah, thanks for the support. Really great to have all the new subscribers along for the ride, and hopefully I can still deliver some useful and meaningful content for your Kendo journey. Anyway, so today I thought I'd touch upon the Bokuto Yoru Kendo Waza Keiko, which is a big mouthful. But basically, it's these basic attack forms. There's 9 of them, and you for most people, if it's introduced to you, it's introduced to you doing the Bokuto. So it's not like the Kendo no kata, like the traditional kind of the regular kata that we do, the 10 forms with the 7 with a tachi and the 3 with the kodachi, the shorter sword. That's there to serve as a link between modern kendo and the kenjutsu, the traditional kind of roots, the koryu roots, that kendo was kind of built upon. The Bokuto Yoru Kendo Waza Keiko, that's a modern invention. Literally within the last, I guess, if I had to guess, it's probably within the last 2 decades. I think it's that recent. Certainly when I started Kendo, which was probably about 2003, I'd never heard of these. It was only when I came over to the UK and, a few years later, got back into my training, then I was introduced to them. But it's really straightforward. You've got three kind of basic forms at the very beginning of it, and then you get into more kind of waza as such, techniques. So basically, you've just got a straight men, kote, do, and skimune to the chest. That's the first form. Then you've got renzoku waza, 2-step attacks. So kote men, which is the second form, and the third form is harai men. Harai is to, when you kind of hit the opponent's sword out of the way, step in and strike men. Then you kind of move on to men, taitari, hikido. So that's strike men, continue in, and it can be interpreted as taitari or taitari then supatsari hikido. And I'll get into that later. I'll get into the interpretation a little bit later. Then you've got men nukido, kote suriage men. Suriage is when you kind of do the glancing blow. So they do a cut and you do like a glancing deflection or parry, and then return with your own strike. Then debana kote and men kaishido, which is where you catch and return the strike. And then finally do uchi otoshi men, which is on the surface of it probably one of the most low percentage useless waza you might find as an example to practice, but that's not the point, and this is what I wanted to get into. So I've heard a couple of times people talk about these forms, I guess, as kind of like a really basic exercise that would be so basic that really would only be kids in Japan that would do it. And I think in the context of Japanese kendo, that's fair to say. Well, it's definitely fair to say that the people who are saying it are people who have lived and trained in Japan, and so they would know. But I think to write them off as just an exercise for kids, that would probably be underselling them. I think there's a bit more to be had from them. So I'll talk about the way I work with them, and this might be handy for you if you're like a junior level coach. So let's say maybe you're like me, where you ended up finding yourself being a coach when you were as like shodan or something like that, right? Um, or maybe like I say, you could be a bit higher level than that, but maybe you don't have like tons of experience. You're not like a high level coach. Like um, I don't know, say fourth dan or higher or something like that, or even sixth dan or higher, really. Um, so maybe you're looking for things that could help you in your coaching approach. So I'll talk about how I use it and why I think there's a lot of benefit to it, and also a general look at kind of kata, or forms. Whenever things are distilled into these sort of forms, these set patterns, why that is. There's I'll probably start off there. It's important to know that this Japanese way, and it's not just Japanese way, that it's a very Asian way of doing things, of distilling principles into forms and then kind of handing those down, like it's almost like a story. You hand those down, and within those forms is contained certain principles, right? And that's kind of how you pass the martial art down. You have to think why the eighth dans and the people, kind of the higher ups in the All Japan Kendo Federation, saw fit to come up with the Bokuto Yoru Kendo Waza Keiko. And really, I suppose what it breaks down to is this is the basics of Kendo, as pertaining to modern Kendo. That's the idea with them. And what am I basing this on? Well, I'm basing this off of teaching that I've had directly from sensei who are Hachidan or Nanadan, Kiyoshi Nanadan, as far up as Hanshi Hachidan. So right, the top level, 7th and 8th Dan. I've heard a couple of interpretations around this. So here's my reasoning for why I do use this in the dojo. I use it in 3 kind of stages. I use it as the Bokuto form, like the kata type form. Then set kind of pattern forms with the shinai, okay? Where you start off quite similarly to how you would do it with the Bokuto, only you add like your stamping footwork, your fumikomi and your follow through and your zanshin, but you still do it as like large kihon, right? Large cuts. And then there's the next kind of level to that, where you shorten the techniques and you expand upon them. So you deal with the techniques in terms of groups of a specific waza type. And then the last one, which is basically seme keiko, where you practice the connection between each other and the pressure, and you reinforce this idea of taking the initiative and creating a genuine opportunity. Okay, so that's the last phase of it, if you will. So the reason I do this is I had a Japanese high-level teacher come over, and actually this happened more than once, and more than one teacher. And they said, because you're based in the West and most of you start Kendo much later in life, you don't have the good fortunes of starting when you're young, living in Japan, you don't have access to Kendo 6 days a week. So it's all well and good to focus on the fundamentals and learn to go straight and learn to do everything big and beautiful. That's fine. But you need to be a bit smarter with your time, and the correction that they left was perhaps you're doing a bit too much of that. And you need to broaden your palette of waza, of techniques, from an earlier stage. And don't be afraid to practice a bit of variety. So, the suggestion was to do things like shorten the suburi at the beginning of the session, because people were doing like 600 cuts, sometimes 1,000 cuts, or something like that in their suburi in a 2-hour session. And so the sensei was sort of observing this and going, you don't need that much. You might do a couple hundred, 2, maybe 300 tops, and that could only, that'll only take you 20 minutes. You can spend the next 20 minutes, and if you know all these basic waza, you can go through all of these in about 20 minutes. And so the kihon keiko waza is a good way of introducing the waza groups, talking about the differences in the timing and the setups and the principles that underpin those, which then allow you to then broaden that out to, as I say, practicing the groups of waza. And then again, that allows you to then eventually expand upon that and talk about the actual seme, the interaction, and how to generate the openings, or some examples of how to do that. And then if you take that on into Jikeiko, then of course you can experiment with that. You can see how different opponents behave. You can see how you behave. What waza do you select? You know, where are you confident? Where are you not confident? What you should practice more? What's underdeveloped? Those sorts of things. So yeah, so the way I like to do it is I start beginners off doing the Bokuto form, and we would do it on occasion. You know, maybe when they start and they've got their basic footwork, they've got their kamae reasonably down, they can do the basic etiquette and things like that. And so I'll just have a look at some point and go, okay, I've got the right mix of people here. This won't slow the group up too much, and you know, I can make the right pairs, that sort of thing. And I'll get them started on it, and they'll learn both sides, receiving and cutting. And for them at that point, it'll very much be about just introducing them to the concept, basically, of what a valid strike is, or what a ippon is, or yuko tatsu. Just this idea that it's not just as simple as hitting the target, that you need to generate an opportunity. It needs to be, you know, you go in and you kind of create some kind of opening. You then need to do a reasonably strong strike with Kiken Tai no Ichi and finish with Zanshin. And I think that's enough, right? And then for the rest of that practice, really what they're learning is, like, they're learning like the basics of like how to grip the sword properly, correct Ten no Ichi, reasonable Kiken Tai no Ichi, and really a big one that's really important is they're just learning to judge the mai, just cut the target, that sort of thing. So that's the beginner stage of that, and you wouldn't do that too often, you know, because you've got lots of excuses to do that in different places, you know, different drills in the dojo. You've got kirikaishi, uchikomi keiko, just basic attack practice with shinai. When you do that basic attack practice, that's what you're doing. You're doing the kihon, right? It's the same thing. Kihon keiko ho waza, it's the same thing. It's just more techniques, depending on how you look at it, right? But if you line up in pairs and they're like 5 times men, 5 times kote, 5 times ski, 5 times do, 5 times kote men, you're basically doing the kihon keiko waza, right? And this is why for some teachers they don't really need to maybe involve it. It's just something that I like to do to start introducing people to the groups of waza a little bit earlier, and hopefully give them a little bit of a grasp on what a valid strike is a bit earlier on in the kendo, because I wish somebody had done that for me. For a long time, I was just trying my best and throwing myself at opponents, and I didn't really understand what I was supposed to be trying to do. And then there's the techniques themselves. So then there's the next stage where we get them into bogu with shinai, and you do it as full attack practice, right? But you're still kind of working along that same sort of format. So you're just doing your basic men, kote, do, ski. Then you get into, say it's the man taitari hikido, or tsubutsurai hikido, right? I'll then expand upon that, and we'll do a couple of examples. So we might say, well, that's one way to open the doors, to, you know, give the push down in tsubutsurai. Another way could be to, you know, to say, for example, threaten the men, so it becomes hiki men practice. So you step back, you do a katsugi kote to sort of feign that you're going to strike the kote. They go to block the kote, you strike the men. Or instead of, when you push down from tsubutsurai, like the first example in the kata itself, you strike men instead of striking the door. You know, many people are wise to people pushing down to try to get a lift, and it doesn't happen in real life. You don't actually get that chance for door. But a lot of people, when you kind of step back and lower the sword, they think you're backing off, and they drop their guard a bit. And then we'd have other examples. So, like, for example, if it's the kote suriage men, which is the basic form, you could do that as kote suriage kote. You could do it as men suriage men, and you could do that on both sides of the shinai, you know, omote and ura. With the kaishi waza, so like men kaishi do, that becomes kote kaishi men, men kaishi men if the height differences allow for it. The uchi do uchi men, that becomes I kote men, or kote uchi men, which instead of being quite a low percentage waza, then suddenly becomes a fairly high percentage waza for success. It's quite useful. And then, of course, one of the most important ones, which is just, you've got debana kote, and you've also got debana men. And really, if you've got strong debana waza, you can do all the waza. And so that's how you kind of start to unpack that. And you've got to remember, you can, as I said, you can do things from hiki waza as well. So like harai waza, you can do harai waza from super sari as well. And so that just gives people a bit more dimension, right? And usually by the time they're starting to practice at that level, they're probably shodan or higher. Starting to really kind of unpack a little bit more depth to their waza. And that journey lasts from like shodan to sandan, right? At a certain level, we're looking to kind of practice, and any waza practice that we do, any kihon waza practice that we do, from a certain level, I'm looking for, so this is usually like from third dan and above, we're looking to try to practice seme-ai, or seme-kaishi is another term I've used to describe it, but it's kind of the back and forth pressure. So we really want to build a connection. We don't just want to kind of, step in, go on autopilot. Instead, we want to have the person who's the kakarite, when they approach their motodachi, that you want to do the kakegoe from outside attacking distance if you can. Step in, form a bit of connection, build a bit of kind of pressure, mutual pressure and tension there, and then ultimately you want your kakarite to kind of step in and take the initiative, and then the motodachi can feed the opportunity to them that way, so it feels more natural, it feels more realistic. And they can also do things like use their shinai to generate a realistic opening, so that the motodachi understands kind of when they want to pull the trigger. For example, if we look at the debana men practice, or any of the ojiwaza practices, you'll see that in a couple of these examples, I'll step in, and let's say it's a kote suriage men, for example. I will pressure against the aite's sword, against their shinai, to give them an opportunity to strike my kote. So I'm telling them I want the kote now, and so that way I can try to make my suriage waza very sharp, like kote suriage men. If it's debana waza, the same thing. Like, say I want them to attack my men, I'll step in, I'll generate a bit of pressure, and then I'll open the men, to give them that chance to strike. And I'll expect motodachi to go straight forward to strike in that instant, so that I can develop a sharp debana men in response to that. So that would be the final tier of how we practice it. But it's all based on the principles that I teach or coach people in when they learn the very basic forms. So, it's just about where you focus your efforts. So when it's Bokuto, you focus your efforts on the real basics. Kikentai no ichi, the mai, cutting to the target area, hasuji, angle of the blade, things like that. The second tier is kind of where we start to unpack. I like to think of the Bokuto Yoru Kendo Waza. I tend to think of that as kind of like zip files, right? So each one. So let's say you've got harai men, the third form. Harai men could be harai ura, harai omote. It could also be any harai waza against kote as well as men. So I could say to anyone, if they're practicing at the second tier, we're going to practice harai waza, 5 times harai waza, and they can freely practice which ones they want to do. So let's say they're quite confident with harai men on ura, but maybe they're less confident on omote for kote men. They can spend their time practicing that if they want to, or predominantly that. And I'll tell them if that's the case. Or I may specifically say, like, I've noticed ones that are weak, and I'll say, okay, well, this is 2 of these, 3 of those, and then rotate. 2 of these, 3 of those, 2 of these, 3 of those, rotate. That sort of thing. And it's the same thing with kaishi waza. You could do, take kaishi do, and you get kote kaishi men, you get men kaishi men, that sort of thing. So like I said, like each form can kind of be like a zip folder. When you unzip it, there's actually several forms. It's about taking the principle that you're learning on how to do that one example, and then you need to apply that to other examples, and then you can basically extend your repertoire of waza, of techniques that you have at your disposal. So that's it. That's all I wanted to talk about. I find it useful, a useful place to start people off, and then now and again we come back to it, and we come back to it at different levels. As I said, you've got the practicing the real basic ways with Bokuto, where you really focus on just Kiken, Tai no Ichi, distance, the Mai, and Datatsubu, striking to the correct target, that sort of thing, and a real basic understanding of Zanshin, yeah? Then you've got the next level where you're doing it in your Bolgu with Shinai, and you're starting to extrapolate groups of waza, and you're starting to look at the principles that underpin each one, instead of looking at it as like a literal situation, because that's what kata are, not a literal situation. They're a collection of forms that contain principles. The principle is more important than the actual technique itself sometimes. That's important to remember. And then of course you get to the final level, where it becomes very much about the connection. You can practice a variety of waza very fluidly, depending on the situation that you find yourself in with the partner that you're working with. Whether they're tall, they're short, do they like to come forward and attack, do they like to wait a bit and kind of see what you're going to do, are they always suspicious of a trap, do they hesitate, that sort of thing. And so you would pick and choose your different waza depending on the situation at hand. So that's my view on the kihon Keiko waza. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you practice it in your dojo? Having watched this, maybe you didn't practice it before. Maybe you'll consider practicing it now. I don't know. Just give me your opinion. And otherwise, yeah, really nice to be back. And thanks for the support. And hopefully I can come back soon and do another chat. All right, take it easy. Bye-bye.